Institutional theory between isomorphism and decoupling. Institutional theory has been around for a long time and is very popular in disciplines of social theory practices. It attempts to understand how institutions interact with its surrounding social systems. It sees the institution as being the building block of society. This presentation will cover the following areas and provide a cognitive perception of the underlying principles of the theory and applications. What is institution? Background and theory. Dimensions, isomorphism and decoupling. Institutional controls. Concerns related to higher education institutions. Limitations, and finally research fields related to institutional theory. Institutional theory revolves around aspects deeply related to social structure. It considers the processes by which structures, including schemes, rules, norms, and routines, become established as authoritative guidelines for social behaviour. According to Scott, institutional theory is comprised of regulative, normative, and cultural cognitive elements that, together with associated activities and resources, provide stability and meaning to social life. We will start with the regulative pillar, which includes rules, laws, policies, and their associated sanctions that the society is expected to abide by and which institutions follow. Next is the normative pillar. This includes the norms and values running through the institution, which are the foundation for its ethics, individuality, or personality. These give ideas of the correct way to behave and perform, and such elements can be maintained through systems of education, accreditation, and professional development. Finally, we come to the cultural cognitive pillar. These are the ways of getting things done that are often taken for granted. For example, the way a medical physician acts, or that you would expect an engineer to be good with numbers. Institutional theory sees people and organisations as being engaged in a quest for legitimacy, or perhaps it is this quest which produced institutions. Nations, organisations and individuals want to fit in to conform to a legitimate version of themselves, how certain features and characteristics add to the notion of the accepted role through the preconceived ideas of what it is supposed to be. A lawyer is more legitimate if he has a business card and a fancy office. Food packaged in a certain exquisite manner deceives people into believing that it is clean and deserves the heavy price paid for it. People behave as they do because of conformity that has been seen as rational. According to Meyer, many formal organisational structures arise as a result of mirroring of rational institutional rules. Institutionalised products, services, techniques, policies and programmes function as powerful myths, and many organisations adopt them as a means of gaining legitimacy, resources, stability, and hence increasing their survival prospects. To maintain conformity with rationalised institutional myths, organisations tend to buffer their formal structures. In other words, they build gaps between the formal structures and the actual work activities. For example, higher education institutes might respond to pressures in the institutional environment by making symbolic changes in their structure and procedures, but these are not reflected in classroom practice. This is known as loose coupling. Organisational fields is a term that refers to organisations that, in the aggregate, constitute a recognised area of institutional life. For example, key suppliers, resource and product consumers, regulatory agencies, and other organisations that produce similar services or products. According to Dimaggio and Powell, the structure of an organisational field can be defined on the basis of the following points. Firstly, an increase in the extent of interaction among organisations in the field. Secondly, the emergence of sharply defined inter-organisational structures of dominations and patterns of coalition. Then there is an increase in the information load with which organisations in a field must contend with. A mutual awareness then begins to develop among participants in organisations that are involved in a common enterprise. And finally, once different organisations in the same line of business are structured into an actual field, they become more similar to one another and the practices also become similar. This helps explain why institutions operating in an organisational field are alike, and this process of homogenisation of institutions is called isomorphism. According to Dimaggio and Powell, isomorphism is a constraining process that forces one unit in a population to resemble other units that face the same set of environmental conditions. There's two types of isomorphism, competitive and institutional. There are three mechanisms through which institutional isomorphic change occurs. The first of these is coercive isomorphism. This results from formal or informal pressures exerted on the organisation by the government, other organisations, or the environment. These pressures are often associated with legal requirements, health and safety regulations, and so on. For example, manufacturers might be forced to adopt new pollution control technologies in order to conform to environmental regulations sanctioned by the government. Now we come to mimetic isomorphism. Mimetic forces are pressures to copy or emulate other organisations' activities, systems, or structures. Innovations that are deemed to enhance legitimacy are seen as desirable, especially under conditions of uncertainty. The third source of isomorphism is normative, and it describes the effect of professional standards and the influence of professional communities on organisational characteristics. They capture the ways in which institutions are expected to conform to standards of professionalism and to adopt systems and techniques considered to be legitimate by relevant professional groupings. These norms are conveyed through the education and training of professionals and certification processes accredited by the professional bodies. Now we move on to the predictors of isomorphic change. There is a difference in the extent to which organisations in a field change to become more like the others operating in that same field. Some organisations might respond to external pressures quickly, while others change only after a very long period of resistance. Points A1 and A2 are based on coercive isomorphism and constraint, whereas points A3 and A4 are mimetic thought processes. A5 is based on normative processes found in professional organisations. Next, we come to the field-level predictors or measures that affect organisations. The first of these states that the greater the extent to which the field is dependent upon a single source, the higher the level of isomorphism. When organisations in a field are dependent on the same suppliers, then these organisations are placed under similar pressures. Secondly, the more interaction of the field with the state, the more isomorphism. Here we talk about how organisations in a field adopt and conform to the state rules and regulations. The fewer the number of organisation models, the quicker the isomorphism can be expected to occur. And the more technological uncertainty or goal ambiguity, the greater the rate of isomorphism. These 2 points talk about how isomorphic change arises from uncertainty and modelling. Finally, the more professionalism in the field, the more isomorphism can be expected to occur. This is based on the idea of professional socialisation within an organisational field. If we now look at some of the new isomorphic pressures, we see that institutions in a field emulate or mimic the models and traits of other institutions within their field that they perceive to be more successful. So, for example, they may think, Oxbridge is doing this, so perhaps we should do it too, and so on. The performance will be governed by competition existing within that field and the markets that they operate in. An institution is defined as fit only if it can do and offer everything that the other comparable institutions offer as well. Agents within an institution may wish to be seen to adopt various practices or structures, commonly those that are perceived to be good, but in reality their actual practices can be very different from those that are publicly known or formally sanctioned. Decoupling is where there is a separation between the actual practices of the organisation and those that are formally presented by them. The organisation is actually only appearing to comply with external expectations. Decoupling can be protectionist, ethically monitored, or unethically driven by greed and shady practices. Institutions attempt to seek shelter by closing in their internal structure and operations to outsiders, but provide comfort to the public by conducting their own quality assurance and commitment to the customer. This allows them to protect their product and show only the shiny side of what they do. The organisation now acts as its own assurance team. This does not inherently mean that they are illegally or unethically practicing, but it may do in some instances. Many structures in formal organisations come about from rationalised institutional rules. These rules can then be taken outside of the institution, leading to a spilling over of the formal organisation structures into society. According to Meyer and Rowan, institutional rules function as myths which organisations incorporate, gaining legitimacy, resources, stability, and enhanced survival prospects. This slide introduces the ideas of similarities between organisations. The tendency of an organisation to seek similar practice in an effort to align itself with expectations and perceptions leads to isomorphism. Eating at a fast food restaurant provides the customers with similar experiences, whether it is in China, France, or Uruguay. The product becomes the experience rather than the food itself. This is a direct result of the isomorphism of this organisational field, a building block of the theory. This does not, however, explain why some institutions opt for providing an alternative experience and take a unique approach. Perhaps this would be something to explore. Or one could say that the sheer isomorphism is what led to this drift in the first place. We will now move on to the role of rationalising agents in institutional control. Many organisations achieve legitimacy in their field through a social construction of reality. This reality can be made up of cultural and social influences, expectations, norms and values. Organisations make decisions rationalised around their environment, and rationalising agents can act as the process that drives isomorphism and the presence of entrenched institutional norms. In addition, they can prevent or constrain the organisation's ability to change further in subsequent years. So making decisions that conform to the rational norms can help organisations legitimise their choices and behaviours. First, we will explore regulatory rationalising agents, wherein conformity to the legal system acts as the basis of legitimacy. Examples may include legal frameworks, policies and rules that organisations have to follow as opposed to want to follow. Non-governmental soft regulation could also be included here. These regulatory agents may act to constrain organisations, with coercion possibly being an enforcement mechanism. Experts may also act as rationalising agents. For example, organisations may legitimise practice by following a gold standard determined by empirical evidence and expert-led research. Organisations want to fit in with a consensus view. For example, in the case of how they would respond to innovation, institutions may play follow the leader. The sector will all follow each other, and this response then becomes legitimised. Finally, we move to the public as rationalising agents. Each organisation is part of a wider social system, and Meyer and Rowan suggest that organisations are, in part, the result of increasing rationalisation of cultural rules. If we come back to the example of fast food, if a particular chain of restaurants offers a cheeseburger on the menu, their customers will expect the same quality of product and consistency in the taste and the experience across the different geographical locations of the restaurants. The public's expectation of the product continues to drive control. We will now consider how institutional theory may impact or concern higher education institutions. The perception of a higher education institute, the expectations, the ethics and values of the institution are determined by their own norms and beliefs, and these are often established by both competitive and institutional isomorphism. The impact of marketisation trends and regulatory agents also affects the higher education institute framework. To take an example in the UK of the relatively new tuition fee regimen, in England fees are capped for UK and EU students, but around 75% of institutions charge the full amount. Institutions have looked to other organisations in their field to set a benchmark which they may all follow. Although autonomous, organisations can have a common controlling mind, acting as a global higher education system. Of course, every theory will have its limitations or deficiencies, and in relation to institutional theory has a heavy emphasis on conformity. It does not necessarily offer any room for agents to change the institutional scripts. As we've alluded to previously, some institutions position themselves away from the isomorphic organisational field. Outlier startup companies, for example. Institutional theory has little to offer that explains this practice. In addition, institutional theory does not offer an explanation for institutional change. The theory focuses on the institution's own norms, beliefs, and values, and does not consider the influence of external environments when managing change. We are now going to consider areas of interest in higher education research. Use of institutional theory might suggest that the researcher intended to take an interpretive approach to the research design. When considering the avenues that could be explored, one could look at the existing organisational structure in an institution to discover if the processes within this institution are fit for purpose. You could consider disconnect or decoupling between organisational practices and the views of the actors involved in carrying these out. You could research possible trends and innovations, the emergence of new institutions and how they situate themselves in the organisational field. There are also links and contrasts with other theories or approaches, such as structuration, practice theory, and ideas of the assumptive worlds. Using one particular theory probably doesn't prevent the use of others to explain phenomena, as there are many links between them. Finally, we have detailed here the papers and other resources that were referred to when creating this presentation. We hope that you have found our presentation useful and informative, and we thank you for listening.